colleagues of the Senate, and I do appreciate my good colleague from Lincoln, a few factual pieces to make sure that we recognize, not to dispute that there are struggles in Maine, but our unemployment rate in Maine is the same as the national average. And if the good senator would like to know, or anyone here would like to know how raising the minimum wage helps or who it helps, I would encourage you, invite you, be happy to escort you to meet the thousands of people in Maine who are making minimum wage. And we may think that a mere 25-cent increase on their wage this year won't help very much, but I tell you, for folks who are on the edge, for folks who are making minimum wage, for the women who are supporting their families and their children on the minimum wage, $500 a year, which is what this equals, means a lot. We live in a very different world if we think that $500 a year doesn't mean a lot to Maine families, because there are a lot of Maine families who are living on the edge. And when you want to talk about artificial steroid injections to economies, I would say the minimum wage is not even close to an artificial steroid injection. An artificial steroid injection would be an economic stimulus package in which you might provide some tax rebate on a one-time basis, as often seems to be the answer from the federal government to the recession that we are living in today, and the recession that we expect will continue. We know throughout the history of Maine that when you raise the minimum wage, you raise people out of poverty. When you raise the minimum wage, you raise wages in Maine, you raise incomes in Maine, you help families. The evidence is clear. And I was very glad to hear my colleague from Lincoln County talk about New Hampshire and how the gap on their incomes and ours is widening, because, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, it's about to widen even further. They are about to raise their minimum wage above ours, while we fall stagnant if we do nothing today and fall behind further. They, New Hampshire, the fiscally responsible, the great economy, the low taxes, they are raising their minimum wage above Maine's. I would say for the first time, I think, in at least 20 years, because they recognize the minimum wage must be raised in order to raise the incomes of the lowest income of their state, and indeed have that money go back into their economy. Because we did in committee, Mr. Chairman, we got evidence in front of us that showed when bordering states have a higher minimum wage than the state next door, indeed their workers travel to the higher minimum wage state to make money. We saw it in Washington and Idaho, out west. People going into Washington who lived on the border because the minimum wage in Washington was indeed higher. And so people there were, the businesses in Idaho were losing workers, and insisted that their legislature raise the minimum wage because workers were going over, or they had to raise their wages themselves. It's the same thing that we will now see with New Hampshire if we do nothing today. If we do not, at least at a minimum, meet their minimum wage, which is what we do in the first step, and then in the second step, we get ourselves into the middle of the pack to be competitive with the rest of New England. I would also remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that indeed it was President George Bush, the Republican President George Bush, who just signed the largest minimum wage increase in our nation's history, a 3-year bump up to the place that we will be this fall. That president said, yes, I understand, and I believe that the reason that he did it is because he understands that the American people recognize that the minimum wage must be raised. He understands that if we raise the minimum wage a mere $1 an hour across the country, we would pull almost 1 million people out of poverty. But here in Maine, if we raise it, we will be helping families struggling on the edges with a raise of about 3.5%, around 4%, I believe. 4% the first year, 3.9 or 3.8% the next year. I think Maine workers work hard. I think they work to support their families, and they deserve a 4% raise. And they especially deserve it because our bordering states are paying more and our incomes are dropping here. So, colleagues, I would ask you to support the motion before you in the name of those workers who are at minimum wage and in the name of the workers across Maine who are struggling and falling behind, because as the gap grows wider and wider between the wealthiest in this state and the poorest, it only tears apart our social fabric further. We know a widening gap is unhealthy for our economy, so for the sake of our economy, I ask you to support raising the minimum wage today, 25 cents this year and 25 cents next year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.